You are in a conversation. Someone asks a direct question about what you think, about where you are, about who you are, and you answer fluently, confidently, without hesitating. The answer comes out ready, polished, appropriate to the moment. But later, hours later, already far from that conversation, you realize that what you said was not exactly what you think. It was what that person needed to hear in order to keep seeing you the way they see you. It was the answer that kept everything in place, the relationship stable, the sense of belonging intact, the image preserved, and you did not lie. That is the detail that makes everything more complicated. You did not make anything up. You simply selected, with a precision you did not even realize you were using, the version of yourself that fit within that specific space. Now multiply that moment by every context in your life. The version that exists in the presence of family. The version that works with old friends. The version you display for those who admire you, the version that appears in front of those who intimidate you, the version that surfaces when you need to be accepted by a group that does not know you yet. You manage them with dexterity, you move between them without visible friction, and if someone complimented that ability, they would say you are versatile, socially intelligent, adaptable. But here is the question nobody is going to ask in that conversation. At any point in that day, in any of those contexts, with any of those people, did you exist as yourself? Not as the strategically selected version, as you, the judgment that belongs to you alone, the position you would hold even without approval, the thought you would have even if nobody were there to witness it. Or was there a self somewhere waiting for a permission that never came? What was described above is not hypocrisy. It needs to be said that way, with that precision, because the first reaction of almost everyone upon recognizing that pattern is guilt. And guilt is the wrong path for understanding the mechanism. You did not fragment your identity out of weakness of character. You fragmented it because the system that has surrounded you since birth was designed, with or without intent, to produce exactly that result. Conformity rewarded, singularity punished, belonging conditioned on fitting in. The self you present in each context is not a lie. It is a rational response to a real set of incentives. Each fragment was built because it worked, because it generated approval, acceptance, continuity of relationship. Because the alternative, presenting yourself whole, without prior editing, already cost you dearly at some point, and you learned from the cost. This is not exclusive to you. It is the default state of an entire generation that learned to manage identity before learning to have one. Let us name the concrete forms in which this fragmentation operates, because it is more sophisticated than it appears on a first reading. There is fragmentation by context, the multiple versions you already recognized, but there is also fragmentation by anticipated approval. The moment in which you censor a thought before expressing it, not because it is irrelevant, but because you have already calculated the reaction it would produce and decided the cost is too high. The thought never reaches the other person. Sometimes it never even reaches you with clarity. It remains suspended, half-formed, waiting for an environment that is never safe enough for it to complete itself. There is fragmentation by accumulation, the slow process in which you gradually seed small layers of your own judgment in exchange for belonging. Each individual concession seems reasonable. It seems like maturity, like humility, like an understanding that the world does not revolve around your opinions. But the cumulative effect is something else. After years of reasonable concessions, you look inward and realize you no longer know with any certainty what you think about anything that truly matters. The opinions you hold are the opinions of your closest group, with slight variations that allow the illusion of individuality. And there is fragmentation by disappearance, the quietest and most serious kind. The moment you realize that certain parts of you have simply stopped existing socially. They were not hidden. They were abandoned. Interests you once had that none of your current groups value, ways of thinking that you developed and that find no space in any of the conversations you participate in, perspectives that were once yours and that were gradually eroded by the absence of any context to sustain them. It was not violence, it was silent erosion. And silent erosion leaves no visible marks, only a vague feeling that you were sharper at some earlier point in your life, without being able to identify exactly where the sharpness went. Kant spent most of the 18th century asking a question that seemed simple and was devastating. What does it mean to think for oneself, and why is it so rare? The answer he found was not about intelligence, it was not about courage in the epic sense of the word. It was about structure, about the system of rewards and punishments that makes rational autonomy systematically more costly than delegating one's own judgment. What he saw in 1784 is operating on you right now with a precision that required no updating. The question is not whether you are capable of thinking for yourself. It is whether the system around you makes that possible without an unbearable cost. And the answer to that question will change how you understand every fragment of identity you have ever built. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg, Prussia, and spent virtually his entire life within a radius of just a few miles from where he was born. He did not travel, he did not frequent salons, he did not build a sophisticated public persona. He woke up every day at the same time, followed the same route, did the same work with the same radical discipline. And he produced the most influential philosophical system of the modern era. There is a precise irony in that. The man who most rigorously theorized about autonomy, about the courage to think without tutelage, about the emancipation of judgment, was also the man whose outward life appeared as regulated and predictable as possible, as if he knew, with the clarity of someone who has already dissected the mechanism, that real autonomy does not lie in visible disobedience. It lies in the quality of judgment you exercise when nobody is watching. In 1784, Kant published a short text, fewer than 10 pages, called An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? And in the opening lines, before any technical philosophical argument, he made a diagnosis that could have been written yesterday. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority. Minority is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Self-incurred is this minority when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in a lack of decision and courage to make use of it without the guidance of another. Read it again. It is not a lack of capacity, it is a lack of decision, it is a lack of courage. Sapere Aude. Have the courage to make use of your own understanding. Kant was not encouraging anyone to be rebellious. He was naming, with clinical precision, the mechanism by which rational beings systematically abdicate their rationality, and the structural reasons why that abdication is so stable, so comfortable, and so difficult to break. The concept of minority in Kant has nothing to do with age. It has to do with posture. A minor person, in the Kantian sense, is a person who lets another think for them, not because they cannot think, but because thinking for themselves carries costs they preferred not to pay. The book that tells you what you should believe, the group that tells you who you should be, the consensus that defines what it is acceptable to feel, the social code that determines which identities receive approval and which receive punishment. And this is where Kant's argument meets, with disconcerting precision, the identity fragmentation you already recognized. Every fragment of you that was built to fit a specific context is an act of minority, not in the sense that it is wrong or shameful. In the sense that it represents a delegation of judgment, you let the expectation of another define which version of you was valid in that space. This is visible in the most extreme cases. The person who completely changes their opinion when in the presence of someone they admire, or who abandons entire interests when they join a group that dismisses them. But the more common and more invisible operation is subtler. It is the automatic, continuous, almost reflexive adjustment you make in every social interaction to remain within the zone of acceptance of that specific group. You do not notice you are doing it because you have been doing it for so long that it has become second nature. And second nature, by definition, feels like nature. It feels like who you are. Kant would call this state heteronomy, being governed by another's law. The opposite of autonomy, being governed by the law you gave yourself through your own judgment, independent of external approval. The question this raises is simple and uncomfortable. Which of your versions, if any of them, operates under genuine autonomy? Social acceptance carries a cost that rarely shows up in the transaction. You offer conformity, identity adjustment, moderation of judgment, editing of singularity, and receive in return belonging, approval, continuity of relationship. The transaction seems reasonable. It even seems advantageous. But what you handed over is not returned when the belonging ends. The group dissolves, the relationship changes, the approval stops mattering, and the fragments of identity you gave up as the price of entry are no longer available. You did not store them. You reformatted them to serve the reward system of that context, and reformatting has no undue function. Kant would say, the being that systematically delegates its own judgment does not only lose its present autonomy, it loses the future capacity to exercise it, because the muscle of one's own judgment atrophies with exactly the same fidelity with which any unexercised capacity atrophies. There is a narrative the system distributes with remarkable efficiency, the idea that giving up one's most singular positions is a sign of growth, that the person who adapts to every context without friction has developed social intelligence, that the person who smoothed out their most idiosyncratic edges has matured. This narrative is functionally perfect for a system that needs conformity. It transforms abdication into virtue. It makes you not only accept the fragmentation, but claim it as an achievement. Kant would call it heteronomy in disguise, when another's law is so thoroughly internalized that it feels like your own, when you can no longer tell the difference between what you chose and what you were convinced to want. Real maturity, in the Kantian framework, is not the smoothing of edges. It is the capacity to judge for yourself what deserves to be smoothed and what deserves to be kept, regardless of the social cost of keeping it. There is a version of you that never had sufficient social context to exist completely. Not because you deliberately hid it, but because every environment you moved through had its own system of rewards and punishments, and this specific version was not compatible with any of the available systems. It remained suspended. It surfaces in rare moments, in an unexpected conversation with someone you never saw again, in a text you wrote and did not publish, in a thought you had alone that you never turned into words because there was no social vocabulary for it in that context. Kant would not have called this repressed authenticity. He would have called it unexercised judgment, the rational capacity you have and that never found the conditions to develop completely because the cost of developing it always seemed greater than the benefit of keeping it latent. And latent here does not mean protected. It means slowly decomposing. Now let us go to the deeper mechanism, the one that makes this fragmentation not only understandable, but structurally stable. The system that produces Kantian minority does not need explicit coercion. That is its point of greatest sophistication. It does not prohibit autonomous thought. Prohibiting would create resistance, create the position of the martyr, create the dignity of transgression. Instead, it simply makes autonomous thought socially costly in ways that accumulate in a diffuse and distributed manner. It works like this. the person who thinks for herself, who holds judgments that diverge from the group consensus, who presents versions of herself that were not calibrated for the environment's approval, that person faces consequences that are rarely dramatic. It is not persecution. It is not violent exclusion. It is the slight cooling of relationships. It is the silence that falls after a position nobody expected. It is the absence of an invitation to the next gathering. It is the look that shifts register for a fraction of a second. It is the feeling that you said something true and the room became 1 degree colder. These consequences are too small to justify conscious resistance, but they are large enough to condition behavior. And the conditioning happens before awareness. You learn to edit before you know you are editing. You learn to fragment yourself before you have the vocabulary to name the fragmentation. The result is a population of rational, intelligent people, completely capable of autonomous judgment, who exercise that judgment only in the zones where it costs nothing, in the choices the system has already permitted to be individual: aesthetic taste, consumption preferences, positions on matters that have no real relational consequence, and who systematically delegate judgment in the zones that matter: who they are, what they believe about what is worth pursuing, which positions they would hold even under pressure, which version of themselves persists when the approval goes away. Kant saw this in 1784 as the great problem of enlightenment: not a lack of books, not a lack of information, but the structural comfort of minority. The laziness and cowardice, as he called it, that make it so easy to remain a minor and so laborious to exist by one's own judgment. Nothing in the mechanism has changed. Only the vocabulary with which it disguises itself has grown more sophisticated. Here is the structural diagnosis this video exists to name. The identity fragmentation you experience is not a psychological crisis. It is not a sign that you have a self-esteem problem, that you do not know yourself well enough, that you need more introspection or some process of self-discovery that will reveal who you truly are. It is the logical, predictable, and nearly inevitable result of a system of incentives you never chose, but within which you learn to survive with increasing efficiency. The system works like this: coherent, singular identity, resistant to external approval, is systemically punished with gradual isolation. Fragmented, adaptable identity, calibrated for each environment, is systemically rewarded with continuous belonging. You made the rational choice. You survived. The system worked on you exactly as it was designed to work. But here is the inversion Kant proposes, the one that the system, using the vocabulary of self-knowledge and personal development, surgically removes before selling you back a domesticated version of authenticity. A self built entirely to be accepted is not a self. It is a sum of belonging strategies, and belonging strategies have no core. When the groups change, when the expectations change, when the environment sustaining each fragment dissolves, nothing remains. Because what was built to serve the system has no function outside the system. The danger the title names is not a metaphor. It is structural. When identity is entirely external in its origin, when every layer was deposited by another's expectation and not by one's own judgment, there is no self that holds. There is performance without a performer. There are roles without an actor. And Kant would not tell you this is inevitable. He would tell you it is chosen. That minority is self-incurred. That the cost of existing on one's own terms is real, but that the opposing cost, that of never existing at all, is permanent. Let us name what has been dissected here without concession. You do not have a problem with identity. You have a problem with the system inside which any identity has to form, a system that distributes belonging in exchange for conformity with an efficiency that requires no coercion, because it has already internalized its mechanisms inside the very subject it intends to govern. Kant called this self-incurred minority not to blame the individual, but to be precise about where the mechanism operates. It is not from the outside in. It is from the inside out. You execute the delegation of judgment, you carry out the identity adjustment, you edit the thought before it reaches the other person. The system does not do that for you. It simply made the cost of not doing it too high for most people to prefer otherwise. The three forms of fragmentation that were named, by context, by anticipated approval, and by silent disappearance, are not independent. They are the same mechanism operating at different timescales. The first is the visible adjustment in real time. The second is the preventive adjustment before the interaction. The third is the accumulated result of years of the first and second. Parts of you that were seeded so consistently that they stopped existing as an available option. And what remains after years of that system operating is not a corrupted or damaged self. It is a self that never had the structural conditions to fully constitute itself. Not for lack of material. The judgment, the perspective, the singularity are there at some level, but for lack of exercise under real conditions, with real consequences, without any guarantee of approval. Look now at the teaser that brought you here. Stop asking for permission. It is not motivation. It is a diagnosis. Asking for permission to exist is the default state of a person who has internalized Kantian minority, not explicit permission. Nobody goes up to others and asks authorization to have an opinion. The permission being sought is implicit, structural, continuous. The constant reading of the environment to calibrate what can be expressed, the permanent monitoring of reactions to adjust what was said, the systematic anticipation of expectations to edit what is about to be said. This is not a posture you consciously assume. It is a posture that was conditioned by years of learning what the system rewards and what it punishes. And the conditioning is so efficient that you no longer perceive the distinction between thinking and thinking in an approvable way, between feeling and feeling in a communicable way, between existing and existing in an accepted way. Kant wrote the Sapere Aude for a Europe that had spent centuries under religious and political tutelage. The context has changed. The mechanism has not. The tutor no longer wears a cassock or a crown. It wears social approval, invisible likes, the temperature of relationships, the slight chill that comes after a position nobody expected. And the most efficient tutelage of all is not the one that tells you what to think. It is the one that convinces you that what you think, after years of adjustment and editing, is what you genuinely think. Kant offers no comfort. That 1784 text ends with a tension he deliberately leaves unresolved. Enlightenment is necessary. The Sapere Aude is the most urgent imperative he knows. And at the same time, he acknowledges that the conditions for exercising it rarely exist in full, because the system that produces minority is more stable, more comfortable, and more rationally efficient than any alternative he can imagine. I'm not going to offer resolution either. What was done here was to name the mechanism with the precision it deserves, to show where the fragmentation you feel comes from, to show that it is not your weakness, it is the product of a system that worked exactly as it was designed, to show that the philosopher who most precisely diagnosed that system did so in 1784, and that the diagnosis has not lost a single degree of precision. What remains as tension, the kind this video will not close, because closing it would be self-help disguised as philosophy, is the question Kant left behind, and that nobody answers for you. Have you ever existed without someone's permission? In some thought, in some position, in some version of yourself that you held even when the cost was real? Was there a self there that came from your own judgment, and not from strategic delegation? If the answer is yes, you know what it is. And the question then becomes how many layers of editing you have built over it since. If the answer is no, if you search and find no moment in which the judgment was genuinely yours alone, That is the most uncomfortable piece of information this video can produce, and also the most useful, because the problem you cannot name cannot be seen, and what cannot be seen cannot be confronted, and what cannot be confronted keeps operating. Now you see it. This is antidote philosophy, not packaged self-knowledge, not authenticity sold as a product, not the system that promises to give you back a self while requiring you to calibrate it to be consumable. Dissection of the mechanism that produces the fragmentation before any self-knowledge is even possible, because you cannot find a self that never had the conditions to constitute itself simply by looking inward with more intensity. You first need to see the architecture that prevented the constitution. Kant saw that architecture in 1784. It is more sophisticated now, more distributed, more invisible. But the central mechanism, the minority that is self-incurred because the cost of autonomy is real and the system has made the cost of dependence invisible, remains identical. If this diagnosis produced recognition, if you saw your own mechanism being named here with a precision you did not expect, subscribe to the channel. Not to find answers, to keep seeing the systems that operate on you before you realize they are operating. Lucidity is not a solution. It is the minimum condition for anything more honest to become possible.